All right, my name is Nancy Wong. Aloha, Happy New Year. I'm a volunteer for AARP Hawaii. Welcome to our first segment of Fast, Healthy, and Ono Cooking for 2021. Today, we'll be talking about yeast bread and how to make a multi-grain ciabatta bread. AARP Hawaii, let me just move to the next slide here. AARP Hawaii is a membership organization for people 50 and older, but what we do for everyone. We hope that with this series, you can learn some techniques that you can use to build or maintain a healthy lifestyle. So right now, let's do a little bit of quick housekeeping before we move into the program. This is a picture of what you should be seeing at the bottom of your computer screen or possibly at the top of your iPad. So everybody is currently on mute. If you want to submit a question for the chef, please click on the button here that says Q&A and type in your question. Jackie Boland, AARP Hawaii's Community Outreach Director, will be monitoring the questions and making sure they get to the chef at an appropriate time. If you're watching on Facebook Live, you can type your questions in the comments. So we won't be using that raise hand icon there because you'll be submitting your questions in the Q&A. Also, we won't be using this chat command unless you need to communicate a technical issue to the staff or if you win a prize. And yeah, great news. We're giving away 3 prizes of custom spices from Uala Leaf Cafe via random number drawing. If you're chosen, you'll receive a notification from either Jackie Boland or Jennifer Dwight via private chat. So make sure you respond via the private chat. You'll need to confirm your name and email through that chat so that we know where we can send, how we can contact you to send you that prize. Okay, so next, it's my pleasure to introduce Chef Daniel Swift, who will be leading us through this cooking series. Take it away, Chef.
Thanks, Nancy. Mahalo. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Let me share screen here. Get it all set up.
You see it.
Great. Remote mouses work great. Well, Happy New Year, everyone. Welcome back. It's been a month, I think, since our last class. I missed you. I missed doing these classes, and I want to thank Jackie for letting me throw another baking item into the mix. We've got a lot of really exciting classes scheduled right now through the end of June. So keep your eyes on the website and the calendar and the schedule for ones that might be of interest to you. Check them out. And as always, if you have recommendations or ideas for things that you'd like to see or learn, just shoot us an email, either Jackie or myself, and we'll see what we can do to incorporate that into the program. So for yeast breads, this is, something that I've always been super passionate about. I've been baking my entire adult life and teaching for about 20 years. And a lot of people find baking yeast products, yeast breads in particular, to be maybe intimidating or challenging or whatnot. So I'm going to go through sort of the basics. And there are a lot of variables that you can incorporate yourself to make the things that you create sort of your own. Not unlike a lot of the dishes that we've created over the last couple of months, you have freedom and leeway and creativity that can be implemented into what you decide you want to bake. So the one thing I would say to think about or approach a little bit differently, baking bread, yeast breads anyways, is more akin probably to like gardening, because we're dealing with yeast, we're dealing with things that are actually alive. We have to make sure they're at the right temperature. We have to make sure that they are mixed properly. But once you understand those fundamental processes, the sky's the limit when it comes to creating stuff. So I sent out a recipe. I'll go over it as we do the mixing this evening. And I wrote just a couple of highlights here in terms of ingredients So key ingredients in yeast bread, very simple, very straightforward. So you've got flour, water, yeast, and salt. I have these 4 ingredients over here on this side because you really need all of these to make a decent basic bread. Down at the bottom, I have fats and sugars. Today, we're adding a multigrain cooked rice mix, but those are more optional. So you do not have to add any fat in the form of butter or olive oil or lard or shortening into a bread. You don't have to add sugars. You don't have to add grains or herbs or anything else. But you do really need these 4 key ingredients to make a palatable bread. If you were to take the salt away, it loses its flavor. It's still edible, but it's not ideal. You could put salted butter or something on it, and it would work. You take away yeast and you have a cracker basically with flour, water, and salt. But we want that yeast in there today to sort of course, elevate our bread, give it some rise, make it light, and we can control that with the amount. So keep in mind that these 4 ingredients are mandatory. The 2 that we have listed and that I have on the recipe, actually in 3 if you're counting the grains, are sort of additional, just to sort of make something unique and something a little bit higher in fiber, a little bit healthier for us. So for the recipe today, I'm using 100% whole wheat, which is I'm not going to say it's uncommon. It's just normally I would probably go 50-50 with a regular white bread flour mixed with 50% or equal parts of the whole wheat flour. The whole wheat flour has the bran in it, the germ and the endosperm all ground up. So you always end up with a little bit more dense bread because the bran doesn't allow it to rise in the strands of gluten to expand as much as they would if you remove the bran like you would with a regular white bread. So that's why you find them to be a little bit more dense than other breads. Quickly on the yeast, I recommend you get an instant yeast. This is SAP Instant. You can find it at most supermarkets these days. Traditionally, there was fresh compressed yeast, which needed to be dissolved in water. There's dry yeast, which you can still find, I think, in the supermarket, Fleshman's and some other brands. It has to be dissolved in water. And then you have your instant yeasts, like this particular one, which is a little bit stronger and really sort of a foolproof yeast. It's about $3 a pound. Put it in the freezer, it'll last years. And it can be mixed with dry ingredients. So there's a lot more forgiveness and leeway when you're working with that particular type of yeast. So I pulled out some gluten-free flour. You can get good blends today, and you could substitute this 1-for-1 in this particular recipe if you're trying to create a bread that is gluten-free. It's not, it's not going to be exactly the same. The gluten is what gives us the structure, which is what allows it to rise and be lighter than something that doesn't have gluten in it. So, you can experiment with it a little bit, but you're still going to end up with something that's a little bit different than a regular wheat flour yeast mixed bread. So that being said, Jackie, feel free to ask questions anytime.
Well, thank you for the cue because we do already have a question. It is from Myra. She wants to know if you use whole grain flour, would you need to double the amount of yeast?
For this recipe, I did increase the yeast. That's a great question. Normally, you would increase the yeast a little bit. I don't want to get into the mathematics of it. I'm sure there's folks that love math, but maybe it's easier to approach it when you think in terms of ratios or percentages. When you're making bread, actually most baked goods, when you study baking, one of the first things they teach us is baker's percentages. And that's because most of the items we make have a flour in them, like the wheat flour that we're using. And flour always represents 100% of a recipe. So for water, in this case, we're using 80%. So if I had 10 pounds of flour, I'd have 8 pounds of water. Yeast, 2%. You could probably go upwards of 3% if you wanted to, but a standard 2% with this particular yeast will always get you what you need from it. Salt, I tend to go at 3%. Others, a lot of times, a little bit lower, maybe 2%, but the range would be 2 to 3%. And then the other ingredients are just sort of variable. So that's a great question, and I did up the yeast a little bit on this recipe. So I've got the flour.
So we do have, we have 3 questions, plus I wanted to mention if you're watching on Facebook, feel free to put a question in the chat and I'll try to get it to Dan. But Dan, I'm thinking you might want to go on a little bit before we get to these, but people are wondering if you throughout, you could just mention what the difference between bread flour and regular flour is, and if you can switch them back and forth. If you have particular brands of flour, and then I'll save the yeast question for a little bit later, so go ahead.
So I'll address that as I'm mixing here. I want to get this kind of going because I have to stir it and I'll get my work out. I've made like 3 batches today. The mixing method that we're using today is called the straight dough method. And that's basically where everything goes into the bowl and it's mixed together. So sometimes it's called the dump method. This technique and method is applied to cookies as well and some other items in the baking arena. But for us, everything's going in the bowl. So I have the flour, the yeast, the salt, the sugar, and I'm going to pour in just a little bit of the olive oil. I like a little bit of oil in my bread just because it extends the shelf life a little bit, and it adds richness to it. So it doesn't have to be butter. It can be any type of oil that you like. And then I have my water, and there's a range here. This is really important. Hydration is the key. And it's always better to go a little bit on the lower end of your spectrum. I think the recipe calls for 1.5 to 2 cups. So I would start with about a cup and a half. And that's what I'm going to do. And I'm just going to pour it over the yeast just to be safe. And I'm going to save that other 1/4 cup. That was a little short of the 2 cups anyways, because I've made it a few times today. So I was finding that about a cup and a half or a cup and slightly over a cup and a half was working well for this. So I've got that mixed in there. I'm even going to throw in my grains. Now, these are firm multigrain mixture, or it's a cooked multigrain mixture, so it will hold up to the stirring. If you're using a grain that's a little softer, you could mix your bread first and then just fold it in at the end. It works either way. And then, great question. I'm going to just start mixing this as I get going. In terms of the flours, the main thing you look at is the amount of protein that's in it. The protein in the flour is what is going to give you, and you can see this start to come together, is what gives you your structure. That's why it's hard to make breads that are gluten-free, because gluten is the structure, it comes from the protein that's in it. So the different flours that you see, like bread or all-purpose or cake or pastry, they all have a different percentage of gluten inside, or protein. And those are measured and calculated at the mill. They're adjusted based on their particular brand, but a bread flour like this one might be upwards of 14%, whereas a pastry or a cake flour, which is on the lower end of the spectrum, probably closer to about 6%. And then your all-purpose flour, which is really just an American invention, because we want a bread, or excuse me, we want a flour that we can use for everything. So we don't have to stock 4 or 5 different flours in the house. So an all-purpose one would come in the middle there, maybe 9 to 11%, depending on the brand. Okay. And there was a yeast question as well.
Yeah, and we have several more questions. So
Okay.
Lindy wants to know, if I use a packet of instant yeast, it equals 2 1/4 teaspoons. Are 2 packages needed?
Yeah, I don't use packaged yeast, but in this particular recipe, we're looking at 1.5 tablespoons. So there's 3 teaspoons in a tablespoon. So you would have to just do the calculations there. I would recommend, if you're going to bake at home, just buy a pound of one of the brands like this for, I think it's $3, maybe $2.75. Put it into a deli cup, which is what I do, and label it yeast, and I just keep that out. We use it pretty quickly, so it can stay out at room temperature, or throw it in the freezer and it'll last years, basically.
And Anonymous would like to know, do you use table salt or rock salt?
Always use table salt. Kosher salt would work. Rock salt or Hawaiian salt, a little too coarse, wouldn't break up. So a regular Morton's salt works really, really good, because the granules are super small.
Great. And then Catherine's asking, if you keep the yeast past the expiration date, is it bad? I know a good way to test it, but what's your answer there?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to test it, it doesn't really go bad. Yeast is a living organism, right? So it might be a little less active than you would want it to over time. But if you just put it in some warm water, maybe a pinch of sugar, you'll see it bubble up. If it's not bubbling up, it would need to be discarded. But I don't know that I've ever had yeast that went bad, but we do go through it pretty quickly, which is why you want to probably be careful buying it at the certain supermarkets. Because they might not move the product that quickly. Whereas if you go to Chef Zone or one of the other stores where you can pick up a pound like that one that goes more quickly with people shopping more regularly, it would probably be better.
Okay, and someone's saying they're seeing two pics of Dan that are both the same. Is it possible to have one doing the close-up of you and one doing the far view?
Sure.
Yes, I think it is possible.
Yep.
And then Jan's saying, you know, she has arthritis in her hands. Is it okay to use a mixer?
Yeah, absolutely. I have a mixer behind me here. I probably mix 99% of the bread that I make with a mixer. I only do this particular one by hand because you can see this is sort of almost like a batter. This is about the wetness that I'm looking for here. This is going to be the highest hydration rate that you can really do with the bread. If you approach about 80%, you can't really go any higher than that because it just gets too soupy and too wet. So I've stirred this now for a few minutes. I have on the recipe 100 vigorous stirs or stir it for 5 minutes. So it's getting very close.
Okay,
And
so we have 3 people that want to know what were the mixed grains that you added.
The ones that I used this time was just a wild rice blend. I get this at Safeway. I use it a lot at home, and I use it in soups, all kinds of stuff. It's a Lundberg brand, and it's got wild rice in it. It's got white rice. It's got barley, a bunch of different grains in there. But there's a lot of different brands out there you can choose from. Here's another one that my wife really likes. This is a whole grain mix. It has 8 different grains. This one has quinoa in it and a couple different other ones. Or you could even just use straight brown rice if you're cooking it, or lentils, or anything that you have that you'd like to add into a bread. It can take it really, really well. So this was inspired, I mean, probably 15, 18 years ago I had some beef barley soup that was left over. So I strained it, and then I mixed the beef and the vegetables and the barley into some bread I was making, and it turned out awesome. So since then, bread has sort of become an avenue for me to utilize leftover items in the kitchen sometimes.
I would never have thought of that. So we have about 9 questions, so I'm going to let you continue without answering for a minute, except there was one about water. Somebody was asking, how warm should the water be? How do you know what warm enough is?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Warm water is what we say. So if you touch, you're 98.6. So if you fill water against the back of your hand and it feels warm, it's going to be slightly more than that. The important thing is to remember that yeast, or to note, I guess, if you haven't learned it, yeast will die at temperatures of about 140 degrees. It is basically like us, right? It likes moderate humidity. It likes 85-degree temperatures are perfect and ideal for it. So, I mean, I don't want to get too detailed into the desired dough temperature is what we call it in the kitchen, where you're measuring the ambient temperature of everything, and then your water is the adjustment in terms of temperature to get a desired dough temperature at the end of mixing. So if you're using a mixer like this, every minute you mix it, it increases the dough temperature 1 degree. So, as long as it's warm, you're good. And then we'll move on. I can feel the AC in here is on, and they keep it super cold here, which is an issue if you're making bread. So as I mentioned before, it's sort of like gardening. You can't pick the tomato until the tomato tells you it's done and ready to be picked. You can't look at the instructions and say, on day 23, pick the tomato. You just sort of have to get a feel for it. So I'll set this one aside and pull this other one up. It should be close. And yeah, did you have another question, Jackie?
Yes, so many questions. Okay, so How about this, Dan? I'll ask and then you just interrupt when you need to say something that's not question related, because there are a lot of them. For someone on a low salt diet, how much could they reduce the salt without ruining the results? That's from Janine.
Yeah, the salt is 2% of the weight of the flour. So it's almost negligible. You could probably go with 1%. But I think, if you had 10 pounds of flour, 8 pounds of water, 2% of yeast or of salt would be less than that. So you'd be at like a couple ounces. And then by the time you're getting it to where this recipe makes like 10 to 12 servings, it's almost negligible, but you could probably reduce it by half. But I wouldn't leave it out completely, because you're not going to get the taste that you're looking for.
Okay, and then a couple people I think didn't hear, but he did say that you could use a mixer, a stand mixer, or a hand mixer, although a stand mixer is a lot stronger than a hand mixer.
Yeah, if you're gonna mix this particular bread, ciabatta, because it's highly hydrated and wet, you want to use a paddle. Don't try to make it with your dough hook. You want a paddle for this one. So this in a mixer for like 4 minutes to 5 minutes on low, medium, low speed would work just the same as me mixing by hand. And you can sort of see here, this is the one that's rested. It's about doubled in size. Here's the one that I just finished mixing. So what I'm going to do is just set this one aside. I would cover it and put it in a warm place. This bowl is warm. I had it on top of the oven in the kitchen.
Okay, and I can't find who asked it, but I loved it. Somebody has your uala leaf seasonings and they want to know how much of that could they use in this recipe.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I would dry herbs. I'm not sure which seasoning it is that you have. If it's the salt, then I would just use it in place of the salt with the herbs that are in there. If it's the straight up seasoning and herb blend, I would go with, probably looking at this recipe, on the high end, a tablespoon, on the low end, a teaspoon would work. Your dry herbs are a lot more concentrated than your fresh herbs, but you could put fresh herbs in here too. That would be great. Any of these things.
And I think the round plastic tub is the herb seasoning, right? For the uala leaf.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that's the one we've been awarding to people. If a regular flour is used, how much gluten flour should be added to a cup of flour to create bread flour?
All wheat flour has gluten in it. So if you're trying to take like all purpose and turn it into a bread flour, I guess, I don't know if that's the question, but I wouldn't try to make your own flour blends unless you're just taking a bread flour and mixing it with a whole wheat flour or something like that. Don't try to like take all or cake or pastry flour, which is on the low end of the protein spectrum, and bread flour on the high end, and then mix it together to make your own all-purpose. I would, for consistency's purpose, try to just purchase the brand that you want to familiarize yourself with and work with regularly, because otherwise you might end up with a little bit different ratios each time and find inconsistency in the products that you're baking.
Okay, and then Walter's asking, does flour expire? What about rye flour? Does sugar expire?
Sugar does not really expire. It might harden and get humidity and chunk up a little bit. Flour does expire. It'll get rancid, anything with oil in it like that. So rye flour is more of a grass. It doesn't have gluten in it, but it will also go rancid. So any nuts or anything with oil like that you'll find in the wheat flours, will go rancid over time, and you can sort of tell by the smell. So your best bet is to store it in the freezer if you have room, so that you don't have to worry about it. But most of them will have a date on them, and if you just give it a smell, you'll be able to tell the difference. And then I'm just pouring this out real quick, Jackie, to show everybody.
This is a perfect time for this question from Anonymous, which is, could you please explain the difference between a stiff dough and a slacker dough?
Yep. A stiff dough is something that has less hydration, which would be like a bagel. If you're working with a bagel dough or some other doughs like that, they can be around 55% hydration, whereas this is, like I said, closer to 80, maybe even 75%. But a slack dough like this one, I can touch it with my finger, and let me switch it, get my mouse over here. You can see I just gently poured it out onto the board. You can see that if I touch it, it sticks to my finger. This is a very wet dough. So you would not be able to shape rolls or anything like that with this particular dough. What we want to do is just gently turn it out. I don't want to lose any of the air that I've incorporated and allowed to rise while it sat for about 30 minutes. And now I'm just dusting it with flour. I'm going to make two loaves out of this particular batch of bread. So I'm just going to simply cut it in half. And I'll move these up here so I can set a sheet pan up here. But there's a lot of options with what you can do here. So I'm just going to cut it in half. And I always tend to flour my hands a little bit so they're not going to get too sticky. And then I'm just going to take my hand underneath the bread, pick it up, and then just transfer it back down. Don't tap it and roll it or knead it, or it's I don't know if it's from Play-Doh working as a kid, but when we're working with dough, we want to just touch it and all of that. Here, you can't do that. You don't want to do that. So I'll take the other one and just transfer it over as well, like that, gently. And because it's a really wet dough, you can see some of it stuck to my hand. You do have to be careful. So practice with this a little bit. You might want a little less hydration. If you don't want that slack dough, you can pull back on some of the water and make a little bit stiffer dough. You probably would need a mixer, or you'll be kneading it by hand on a board. You wouldn't be able to do it in a bowl with a spoon. So this is basically exactly what we're looking for here. There's a lot of different ways that we can bake this, and I'll show you a couple here because I made some earlier. But there's a lot of options. This is now ready to go in the oven immediately. So we have, the reason I teach this technique is because it's simple and it's fast. So basically you can create a yeast bread with this technique, start to finish at the table, serving it in about 90 minutes. We're skipping, there's 12 steps in bread making. I won't go through them. I could probably only remember 11 anyways. But if you look it up, we're skipping a number of those steps in this process because we're only allowing one fermentation. Normally, you would then punch this dough down, shape it into individual balls, put it on your bench, and allow a secondary fermentation to take place. In this case, we didn't do that. We just mixed it like we did here. We're allowing it to double in a warm place, and that may take 30 minutes. It may take an hour. You just have to keep an eye on it. We gently put it out onto the board, cut it, transferred it to our pan, and then we go immediately into the oven. So we already have the proofed bread done. We just need to now bake it. And once it gets baked, it'll come out something like this. So this one was a little bit more slack, so it's a little bit flatter than the other one was. A couple other things you could do, I did earlier. I cut smaller pieces. So I just did some rolls. And when it was on the board, I just used my dough divider and cut smaller pieces like that. And if you did a straight white bread flour instead of the multi-grain, this is a white bread. It comes out pretty much the same way. I also baked one earlier in a Dutch oven. So I just took the dough and oiled the Dutch oven, poured it in, and then let it rise for about 30 minutes and put it in the oven. So I ended up with like a nice loaf of bread. This took a little bit longer. This took about an hour, whereas the other ones that we did, the smaller rolls were about 15 minutes. These loaves were about 30, 35 minutes. This was an hour, maybe about an hour and 5 minutes. So it just depends on the size. Cool. Are
you ready for some more questions?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. There's 13 of or 15 of them.
Sure.
So I do want to mention before we get started with the questions that the winners of the door prizes are Pam Bruce, Ken In, and Terry Fitzgerald. And Pam and Ken, actually, I have your contact already. Terry, if you want to send me your email in the chat, I'll follow up with you in private. So Jan is asking, do you have a particular brand of flour, particularly whole wheat flour that you recommend?
We get our flours from Chef's Zone. ConAgra is the particular brand, but they're 50-pound bags. If you're interested in learning a lot about bread or kind of diving into it or expanding your knowledge, I would recommend you look at like King Arthur. Look at their website. They sell the smaller bags. You don't want a 50-pound bag. This is a Bob's Red Mill brand. It's a little bit more expensive for a whole grain one or a whole wheat one, but you can find a lot of really helpful resources for baking there, and they make a great product. So those are the ones that I would recommend. But keep in mind, if you're buying whole wheat flour, a lot of times it doesn't move that quickly at the store. So it can go rancid more quickly than regular flour. And you want to find out who's selling it more frequently, so you're not getting a bag that might already be a little bit old.
Well, and I noticed that Safeway in Kaneohe anyway is now selling a lot of variety of flour. So I think the COVID baking phenomenon has really improved our array of flour over at the grocery store.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Paula wants to know, do you brush the flour off before serving it?
You can. That's up to you. I had one here that I had brushed off. Oh, I cut it up. But yeah, you can, if you look at this, and some people don't like that. I always just tell my students, if you look at a loaf that's been wiped off, you need that because it's very sticky, but you can certainly brush it off with a brush. I wouldn't use a wet towel, and it would be like that. But I always tell my students, I can get an extra $1 for this loaf than I can for this, because it looks artisanal, it looks rustic, it looks homemade, and it's true. I've tested that theory many times. But if you don't want that flour, a lot of it will get knocked off if you just take your loaf and tap it and brush it off. You won't really notice it too much. So just stay a little bit on the 1.5 cups, slightly less hydration side. Then it will require less flour on the board. And but to me, this looks beautiful. I think let me switch really quick to the other camera. It's not even baked yet. You can see that it's risen a little bit, and the loaves of bread, they look like they came out of a small Italian village, and it's healthy, it's whole grain.
And so speaking of whole grain, there's at least 3 people on here who want to say, can we make it without the whole grain?
Oh, absolutely. You can do what if you watch our class, what we're focusing on is teaching you sort of a theory, a concept, and a framework for creating your own things. Absolutely, you can pull that out. Matter of fact, these didn't show up well on the camera because they look burnt, but they're not. But this is like a nice whole wheat bread that I did, and I made it more like focaccia style, where I've taken and put roasted or vegetables on top. There's sweet potato, onions, peppers, tomatoes. I tossed them with oil and herbs, and then I put them on top and bake the bread. So you can put things inside, on top, or nothing at all. A straight white ciabatta, like this recipe with just the flour, water, yeast, salt, fat, and sugar. White flour makes an incredibly delicious bread. So yeah, absolutely. Be creative. Don't be bound by a recipe. Just understand that you need a certain percentage of yeast, certain amount of water, certain amount of flour, some salt, and then sky's the limit. And the good thing is that these ingredients aren't expensive. So a bag of flour, even if you make a mistake or it's not the way you want it, it's not like you're cooking with ingredients that cost a lot of money. It's an opportunity for you to trust me, if you buy a 10-pound bag of flour and some yeast and you work your way through that, you'll be confident in your bread making skills by the end of that 10 pounds.
A pound of yeast goes a long way. I do want to just mention that our mission is fast, healthy in Ono, but we are constantly forgetting the healthy part and having to go back and put it in there. So up to you if you want to keep it. So Marianne, I think that might answer your question about whether it's okay to add cheese. But Dan, do you have anything to add about adding cheese to the bread?
Well, like I said with the beef barley soup, I mean, for me, bread is a vehicle that is incredible. If you were to take this, reduce the hydration a little bit and add some chopped jalapenos, honestly, I like the jarred pickled ones, drain them, kind of dry them, chop them with some cheddar cheese, or even the nacho cheese sauce in the dough, and then cheddar cheese on top before you bake it. A jalapeno cheddar, I used to sell a ton of that when we
That
had
sounds good.
in California. So, I mean, think of it as a canvas or a vehicle for you to get as creative as you want. You can almost add anything that you can imagine into or on top of bread.
Okay, we have a ton more questions, Dan, so
Okay.
I'm going to consolidate where I can. But Lindy wants to know, if you're doing your bread in a flat pan and you spread it out, would you let it rise again?
Yeah, if you are doing your bread like this from the ciabatta, I would go directly into the pan from the batch that we mixed. So I would take that and let it do its rise in the pan. Because what we don't want to do with this particular formula is let it rise in the bowl and then put it in the pan and stretch it all out and lose all that air and then wait for it to come up again. That wouldn't end up with the same exact result. So your best bet is to find, this recipe is probably bigger than this pan. You'd need a half sheet pan or like a 9x13, 9x16, and just go straight after mixing onto that. Stretch it out and then let it rise. Great.
And then Lotus Ann wants to know, can you freeze flour?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's with bread flour and your regular all-purpose type flours, they'll last a couple months, no problem. But it's usually more the rye, the wheats, the whole wheat flour, and ones that go rancid a little bit more quickly that we tend to keep in the freezer, just because we don't move through them as quickly as we do with the regular flours. So if you find that you're not going to be using it, absolutely, you can just put it in the freezer. It works fine. But keep in mind, when we're talking about hydration and mixing and dough temperature, if you're taking flour out of the freezer, mixing your dough with even warm water, it's going to cool it down. So you'll end up with a cooler dough and it'll take longer to rise. So you would need warmer water, or you would just allow that flour to come to room temperature.
Got it. And Michelle is asking for the bread cutter, what's a good price? There's a wide range of prices on Amazon.
For a bread cutter?
Right.
Like a knife, you mean? Or
were you using a bread cutting tool or something to, I'm sorry.
Earlier, I just cut it with a French knife, honestly, a regular French knife. They always recommend you use a serrated knife. So most of your serrated knives are considered to be bread knives. Just be super careful with serrated knives. They're like saws, and if you slip with anyone who cooks has probably cut themselves. But if you slip with a French knife and a straight edge and you cut yourself, it's not enjoyable. But if you do it with the serrated, especially a new serrated knife, the results can be much, much worse. So just be super, super careful if you're using serrated knives. But those are the ones that are designed to cut bread. But I can show you here.
She's clarifying, and she's saying a bread divider.
A bread divider.
Is that the metal thing that goes like this? I'm not certain either. Michelle, we might have to think on that. You might have to send us a picture.
I'm not sure exactly what that is. Clarify that and I'll be happy to try and answer it.
Okay, and then I'm all over the map here because let's see. Bev wanted to know for the rolls, how long would you bake those?
Yeah, these took about 15 minutes. So these were small, and I kept it at the same temperature, 400. If you're going into a larger pan to do the whole loaf, you can scale the temperature down, maybe it's 385, and go a little bit longer to where you're baking it for an hour, maybe a little bit longer, hour and 5 minutes or so. But the smaller the loaf, obviously, the quicker it will cook. And also with the sugar content, right? This is very minimal here. But if this was what we call a rich dough that had maybe eggs in it, more sugar, had milk in it, we would never bake it at 400 because the outside would turn dark before the inside got cooked. So your lean doughs, which is what this is, a low fat, low sugar, can go a higher temperature. So you just have to sort of monitor it and pull one out, take a look at it, break it open, take a look at the insides. And
Okay, so
know.
we're running a little bit low on time, but somebody just asked about the recipe. So I'm going to jump in and just tell you, we're using the same Zoom link every week, but in order to get the recipe, you need to register. That's the way that we're able to keep track of our participants, but it's also the way we have less administrative trouble. So register ahead for the sessions and you'll get the recipes about 1 week ahead. And then a lot of people are mentioning that they think the tool that was being asked about was the bench scraper.
Oh, the dough divider.
Bench knife. Yeah, that one.
Yeah, this is, you can get these at most of your like restaurant supply. They have wooden handled ones, plastic handled ones. This is just basically a piece of metal that works. You can also use what we call a bowl scraper. They make these are only a couple dollars. This might cost you like upwards of $20, $25, but it'll last forever. This one's probably 20 years old. And the bowl scrapers are plastic and they work good for scraping the bowl, but you can also use the straight edge for dividing your dough. So
it's great for cleaning the countertop after baking too.
Yeah, absolutely. This is what we do.
Okay, so about 20 of the responses on the Q&A were about that tool. But
okay.
Somebody's asking, okay to use rolled oats?
Yep, absolutely. Anytime you add something like rolled oats, just think again about hydration, right? Rolled oats will absorb a lot of water. So if you're adding rolled oats and you're at 80%, you're probably going to be okay. But it'll be a drier dough than the dough that was adding a cooked rice or a cooked multi-grain rice blend. So just keep that in mind.
Okay, and then somebody asked, can this be used for focaccia bread? And it is actually a focaccia bread recipe, but we didn't use it that way. So can you talk about that a little bit?
It's not a focaccia bread recipe, just because it's not doesn't have the ratio of fat in it. There's a little few differences there. We'd be the same on our flour, but we use white flour. Water hydration would be less because it's a dough that we want to be able to shape. Might be closer to 65, 68%. Yeast would be the same. Salt would be the same. Dry herbs would go into, or I use dry herbs inside. And then the fat content would be slightly higher. In the dough, I tend to go around 10%, maybe 12%, depending on what it's for. And then we line our pan with oil. So we would take our sheet pan, we would pour oil on it. I usually don't use paper in that case. I pour oil on here, and for a pan this size, I'd probably use like 1 cup of oil, olive oil. I'd spread it around with my hands. I'd stretch that dough out, flip it over, and then let it rise. So there's a few subtle differences there, but really the same ingredients. It's just a different hydration, a slightly higher ratio of fat. Plus, it will absorb all that olive oil on the outside, which is what makes it so delicious. At least the one that I make. They don't always have that, but I find that people love it because you can just eat it straight up. It's really, really good. Okay, so I'm co-opting this screen while you answer a couple more questions. Yeah, of course. And then I was going to say on the oatmeal, on the rolled oat question, if you do make that bread, I always put in a couple tablespoons of molasses. So oatmeal molasses bread is awesome, but you may even try steel cut oats. If you were to get steel cut, cook them down and then fold them in, it makes it a little bit more hearty. Terrific. And then a few people asked about sourdough. Can you make this recipe with sourdough? Yeah, sourdough is all the rage, or it was 2020. It's probably still very popular. I almost brought out my sour. We did a sourdough class. I don't think it was for AARP, but Jackie is a sourdough maker. You would substitute in the beginning some of your starter for some of the liquid, and you could make a sour. But traditionally, a sour wouldn't have any yeast. You're just using the natural yeasts that are in your sour, a longer fermentation time, creates a bit more flavor, obviously, and a little bit different there. But you could use a starter in the beginning, I guess, to answer your question.
Okay, and so lots of people have said Chef Zone carries the bench scraper. So if you didn't see that, Chef Zone carries that. I want to just mention to people, if you don't know, we did start this cooking calendar. This is the address. You can still register for all of our events through aarp.org/HI, but this is a shortcut for you. All it has on it is these cooking programs. Now, the sad part is you do have to register individually now, but the good part is it's less likely for us to have all those administrative problems we had last year when we were trying to manage 6 events through one registration site. So the other thing is we are hoping that we can offer this program every week until June. And so we're not so masterful that we have every week figured out. So as we add them, we're adding them to the calendar and you can register for them at any time. The recipes will be sent out either the Saturday or the Monday beforehand. So please register if you want the recipes. And then I do want to just mention we have a few other things going on. We have a lot of caregiving events. If you're a caregiver for an older adult, particularly in February, we're going to be looking at a lot of dementia information with the Alzheimer's Association Aloha chapter. And then I have listed the cooking programs that are already up. And actually, we've got more up. They're constantly growing. And then finally, we're doing a few local spots. So we have our volunteer Ken In is leading a Taekwondo series that just started this week. So it's really not too late for you to join in. It's an 8-week program. And then we have an informational session from Pyro on Hawaii's marine mammal entanglement program. So what do you do if you see a stranded monk seal, whale, dolphin, or entangled? So that should be kind of interesting too. So I just wanted to let you know about those. Chef Dan is willing to stay on and answer more questions, but if you have to go, we completely understand. I'm going to stop sharing. Send it back to Dan. So let me look back in the Q&A.
Well, those that have to log off, thank you for joining us. We appreciate it. It's good to be back. And again, if you have questions, or even if you need this recipe and you didn't get it, you can email me. I can send that to you. So happy to answer any questions you have.
Okay, so looks like, oh, Ronald saying, can you view an old program? Oh, good news, Ronald. My colleague is starting a YouTube channel for us. And the ones that we actually remember to press the record button on, she'll add on. She's already got some up, but probably in another week, she'll have most of the programs from last year. We also have all of them at our Facebook page, which is at AARP Hawaii. Several people are saying, Dan, could you cut a piece of bread that's done so that we can see the inside of it and what it looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll go at an angle just so because it's thinner, so we can see a little bit more of the crumb, we call it. There's 2 parts to a bread, your crust, and then the crumb, which is the inside. So I don't know if you guys can see that.
We can't really, I can't really see it, but I'm blind.
Which,
your overhead camera's not working right now?
it will be. There we go. All right.
Oh, that's good. I can see that. Oh,
So
that's
you
beautiful.
can see the grains in there that run throughout. Obviously, the crust. It's Hawaii, and it's been humid and raining in Kaneohe, so your crust is only going to be crispy for about 20 minutes, and then it becomes soft again. But the crust on the outside, and then the inside crumb, and then this is nice and moist. This is a more moist bread, so it works really well to come back and cut additional slices and toast it. Or to make sandwiches or whatever. A lot of different options with the stuff that you have here. So,
Carla's wondering, how would you store that bread?
Just like any regular bread. Just you can simply put it in a bag or a Tupperware. It tends to last, depending on where you're at and the degree of humidity and the temperature. This should be able to last you on the counter for probably 4 days, 5 days. If you were to put it in the fridge, it would last a little over a week. maybe even longer. You just have to crisp it up, toast it before you use it. So
I notice with my bread, if I make it, I cut it in half and I put one half in the freezer. And because I only like it for about 3 days, and the stuff in the freezer tastes brand new when you take it out.
yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, that's the thing with baked goods. They're aging constantly, kind of like us, I guess. Yeah. Everything ages constantly, but there is a shelf life on it. And when you go into the freezer, it stops that progress. So you can, this bread might be an hour old now. If I slice it, put it in the freezer, it's still only an hour old. So when I pull that slice out tomorrow, the next day, or next week, it's still only 1 hour old. The freezer doesn't magically make it fresh again. If it's old when it goes in the freezer, it's going to be old when it comes out. So the thing I would say, if you're going to make bread, these will be a much higher loaf. You can sort of see these are rising up a little bit higher. It'll probably be another almost half again as tall as these loaves because of the hydration was less. I slice it before I put it in the freezer. So we just slice it at home, put it in a Ziploc bag, put it in the freezer. So if you need 2 pieces, 3 pieces, 4 pieces, just pull them out. You don't want to freeze it whole because then you got to pull the whole thing out, thaw it, and slice it, and then put it back in the freezer. So
in fact, Alice was just saying that slice it before you put it in the freezer, and then you can put it straight in the toaster.
Yep. Or make sliders, right? So even with the little slider rolls, we can.
Yeah, and now Bev is asking, is there a trick to getting a really crisp crust? And before you answer that, I want to just answer all the people who keep asking, can I put this in? Can I put that in? Dan has said you can put anything in. So you can put anything in the bread you want. So how do you get that really crispy crust, Dan?
No fat, right? So like a baguette or a classic white Italian bread is probably the epitome of the crispiest, crustiest bread. So there's 0 fat in there, no sugar, salt, water, flour, yeast, that's it. So, but then again, it stales very quickly. So a baguette will only last 1 or 2 days. In Europe, it's 1 day, and then it's gone. So it's the fat content and the humidity that impact the crust on the outside. But if you're wanting a bread that's really, really crispy, make smaller pieces and eliminate the fat and the sugar that's in it.
What about using steam? Lauren said she uses steam to create that crispy crust.
Yeah, absolutely. If you have the ability to create steam in the oven, or you can just put a cast iron skillet or some heavy pot in the bottom of your oven. So when your bread goes in, you can pour water in, or some people mist it or whatnot. That will also contribute to the crispness of a crust, but it won't make it crisp for an extended period of time. So if you did this recipe or a recipe with fat in the dough and you steamed it, it'll be crisp when it comes out. They're all crisp when they come out of the oven, but it wouldn't retain the crispness because the dough itself, sugars will bring moisture in and fats will soften the dough. So, but that's a great point. If you can add steam, it helps it rise more quickly, and it gives it a nice crisp, crackly crust.
So Victoria is saying her bread is rising very oily. Her bread rising is very oily. Will it be okay? The oil doesn't seem to all be absorbed.
The oil for this particular recipe.
Right.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, you can see, let me switch to the other camera. It should look, because the small amount of oil here, 1/4 cup, it should all be incorporated. Your dough should look like this one. So it should be a little bit wet, certainly, but there shouldn't be any oil unless, did you oil your, oh, I guess we can't ask questions, but if she oiled her bowl, then you might see oil around the edge. With this particular recipe, we don't have to oil the bowl. A lot of times they talk about oiling a bowl before you put your dough into it. But this small amount of fat that we have here definitely would be fully incorporated into the dough. You want to go back and double check and make sure that you only added 1/4 cup, which is like 2 ounces, very, very small percentage. So you could absorb, this dough would absorb, 3 or 4 times that amount of fat into the dough without even noticing any leakage. So it shouldn't be happening. Maybe just stir it some more and let it rest again, but it shouldn't leach out the fat.
Okay, well, we're well over time, so I think we've got to call it. I hope that you folks learned something about making bread. I thought this one is a really interesting one, and there were so many great questions. It can be a real rabbit hole, but it's so fun, isn't it? So, thank you, Chef Dan, for kicking off the new year. We'll see you all next week, I hope.
Again, next week. Yeah.
Check out the calendar and register. I will send a follow-up to this one with the recipe again, but again, please register so you can get that recipe ahead of time. All right, mahalo, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Happy New Year. Thanks, Jackie.
Thank you. I'm just gonna try to make sure I capture the chat real quick.
Yeah.
That was a fun one.
Bread's always fun, you know, and those are great questions too. You know, it's nice to see so many people. I was surprised how many people have made bread, yeast bread. So
I know.
awesome.
Well, if you have a chance and you can look at the Q&A, there were some people with some really technical questions in there that I didn't see how we could answer them, you know, about weights and measurements and things like that. But I could potentially email them afterward if you can answer them.
If there's a way, or you know, they can always just email me questions. It's, I think, the easiest way. If we didn't get to your question, feel free to shoot Chef Dan an email and I'll answer it. So
can you mention your email?
Yeah, Dan Swift at hawaii.edu.
Thanks, Dan. Okay, thank you, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and end the webinar. Mahalo.
Have a great night. Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Thanks, Jen.